Do you find it difficult to have meaningful conversations about God with those you want to disciple? If you feel like this, you're not alone. And there is good news. Discipleship doesn't have to be difficult. The most effective discipleship happens when you simply talk about God in the everyday moments of life. With the D6 Everyday Foundations curriculum, you can simplify discipleship by making these conversations easy. Because of our generational aligned curriculum, all ages, from preschoolers to grandparents and everyone in between, learn from the same scriptures each week. This means you can have those easy conversations around the table, in the car, or anytime, because what you're learning, they're learning too. Discipleship doesn't have to be difficult. Visit d6family.com to learn more and use the link in the description.
Welcome back to the D6 Family Ministry Podcast. We believe that discipleship should not be difficult, so we're here to help you connect the dots between church and home. Together, let's guide each generation, whether related to you or not, to stand confident in their faith. I'm your host, Ron Hunter, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Marianne Howard. Hey, Marianne.
Hey, Ron. So I have a question for you. As a leader and a leader of an organization, and I know that you've also pastored in your time, how do you guard against comparing, coveting, and competing and looking at other competitors? And how do you guard against that not shaping how you lead, let's just say, our organization, D6?
Yeah, I think we have to pay attention to what other people do to determine, are they discovering something we're not doing? But it can't be looking at it through the lens of jealousy. We can't look and go, oh, we got to be like so-and-so. But we can't be so arrogant to think we've got it all figured out. One of the items that we're going to hear inside of this episode and this conversation has to do with copycats. Do we copy other ministries? The very issue that you set up. And, one of two things are going to happen. We're either going to be, you mentioned this off the air, inwardly focused or outwardly focused. If we're outwardly focused, it means that we're trying to minister to other people. But some people think outwardly focused is, oh, we got to look at other people around us and copy them. No. Be you. Now, that be you means be what God wants you to be, not what you want you to be, which is inwardly focused. My preferences. I'm not building an organization around Ron Hunter's preferences. I'm trying to build an organization that's built around biblical principles with a team collaborating, going, how can we serve other people? I tell you what, Brad says it well. Let's listen to this clip on copying other ministries.
And so instead of trying to just copy what someone else is doing, that's why I think it's important to be able to figure out what your church needs, and then go from that perspective of reaching the people that God has placed you in the care of in that community.
I just want to encourage our listeners, if you're a pastor or ministry leader in various, or a leader, or even a parent, this just really hits it. Yes, the title is on healthy church systems, but I think this is for all of us. I think we need to listen to this and evaluate, is our church, our home, our place of business, whatever God's entrusted us with, is it growing? And is it healthy? Let's evaluate that.
Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Brad Ransom. Brad is a former pastor and serves as a denominational leader for Free Will Baptists. He is also the current president of the Great Commission Research Network. He travels extensively speaking in churches and training pastors, church planners, and leaders. He is also the author of the brand new book, Creating Healthy Church Systems. He's a proud husband, father of 3, and grandfather of 10. Brad, thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be with you.
So our listeners don't know this, but we have had many, many conversations prior to this.
We have.
Nothing to do with ministry.
Right.
Nothing to do with your book.
Right.
We have trained together for months, and
Okay.
this is the first time we've talked where our questions have not involved protein, dumbbells,
Exactly.
or things of that sense.
Right.
So
Yep.
I'm not sure how this is going to go.
Yeah, I know. I'm the same way.
But we are talking about your book today, which I'm excited about
me too.
because it's a recent book that just came out.
Right.
Great content. I had the privilege of being able to read it before it even came out, and so I was really excited because there is so much meat and so much depth into it. And once again, for those listening, it's called Creating Healthy Church Systems. I'm curious, what inspired you to write the book? Where did the idea come from, and where did you see this need?
Yeah, actually, it's been a long time in the making in my mind. I pastored for a long time, and before I was a lead pastor, I was a staff pastor at a couple of churches that were really good churches, and they were healthy churches. But really, I didn't even know what a healthy church was. I just was fortunate to be a part of a couple of really healthy churches. And then whenever I became a lead pastor, the church that I went to wasn't necessarily unhealthy, but I was the lead. And so I realized that there needs to be a lot of things in place, systems and what have you, that I wasn't even really sure what they were. But to really see the church grow and to be able to see the church be healthy, I knew there were things that needed to be in place. And so it really kind of came out of a place of just figuring it out. And then in the last 16 and a half years, I've been in denominational ministry, and I've traveled pretty extensively, been in over 300 different churches in the last 16 years. And I've just seen a lot of unhealthy churches and realized that there is a great need for really kind of defining this stuff and putting it down in a way where the average pastor can understand what we're really talking about when we talk about creating healthy church systems.
Well, in the book, you mentioned that so many churches have tried to copy what other churches are doing. I think there's even a lot of books out there with people saying, here, copy what we're doing and do it. Yeah. Almost kind of a business model mentality. But you say they failed because they're not that church.
Exactly.
You can't copy exactly what another church is doing because you're not that church. What should they be doing instead?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the problem lies with those kinds of resources themselves. Not that they're bad resources, because they're not, but they're a lot of times, especially church growth books and things, they're very specific to what one particular church did that's in one particular demographic. And my church is not your church, and vice versa. And so even though we both live in the same city and we go to sister churches, as far as in the city goes, our churches are completely different, and they can't copy each other, and they can't be just a mini one of the other, or vice versa. And so that's what a lot of churches have done, and they've taken models from great churches that have reached a lot of people and done great things, but what those churches did won't necessarily work in their church. And so instead of just trying to copy a particular model, I think it's important to figure out who they are, what their demographics are, who they're trying to reach, and then figure out specific ways that they can reach people in their community. And that may look different depending on where that church is.
When you see churches start copying other churches, do you see frustration happen? Is it burnout? What are some of the symptoms that happen when they try to replicate exactly what someone else is doing?
Yeah, so a lot of times what happens, and I was guilty of this myself many times, and whether it was when I was a youth pastor or whatever, but you go to a conference or you read a book and you hear all these great ideas. And again, I'm not trying to lessen those things, because they're great things and they're important. And you can take nuggets and principles from a lot of different things. But to go back and actually try to copy what one church is doing is going to be frustrating, because you're not going to get the same results that church got, because you're in a different location, you're in a different demographic, the whole setup is different. And so instead of trying to just copy what someone else is doing, that's why I think it's important to be able to figure out what your church needs, and then go from that perspective of reaching the people that God has placed you in the care of in that community.
Yeah, and I know that sometimes we see churches, they copy because they admire what other churches are doing. Sometimes they do it because they're a little bit jealous of what other churches are doing. What might be the danger of churches getting jealous of what the other churches are doing rather than looking at what they have in front of them?
Yeah. Again, I mean, that's, depends a lot on where they are and all that, but it's really easy to look at a church across the country or even down the street and say, man, how come our parking lot's not that full? Or how come we don't have those kinds of glitzy things or whatever? And there is a temptation to try to copy and mimic what someone else is doing. But again, you're the same way that those churches are different. As a leader, we're different. I'm not the same leader as someone else. I don't want to start naming names, but I'm not the same leader as anybody in a mega church or in another church. And so I don't have the personality. I don't have the spiritual gifts. I'm not equipped to do exactly what they do. And so we shouldn't try to replicate it. And we should try to be who we are and reach the people, like I said a moment ago, that God put in our care within our community.
And that's one thing I loved about the book is that you do help people where they are. You're not saying this is where you need to be, try to get there. You're helping them where they are. There was an interesting illustration in the book where you compared the cancer you didn't know you had to a lot of churches today. Can you explain that comparison?
Yeah. So a long time ago, back in 2000, I was a young pastor in my mid-30s and came down sick. And long story, I don't have time to go into all the details of that, but ultimately was diagnosed with colon cancer. And my doctor had told me that this was a slow-growing type of cancer, and I likely had it for a couple of years. And I had no idea. I mean, I was living life. I was raising my young family. I was pastoring my church. I was doing all the different things that I had always done. And it wasn't until my body just completely shut down that I ended up in the emergency room and then going through the testing process and all that. And they discovered that I had this colon cancer and then surgery and all that kind of stuff. And so I relate that to churches because a lot of churches are really sick and they just don't realize it. They may have warning signs or symptoms, which now looking back, I realize I did have some symptoms leading up to my diagnosis. I didn't recognize them as symptoms of certainly not a serious illness, but really an illness at all. It was just little things that I didn't even pay that much attention to because I was busy and like I said, just doing all the things that I did. And so a lot of times churches are shutting down and they don't realize it. And a lot of times it's not until the pastor leaves or they can't pay the bills anymore or there's just nobody left before they're forced to really start looking at why are we having these problems. And so I think the comparison is similar to what I went through to what a lot of churches go through.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk to you about the difference between church health and church growth because we often use those terms synonymously, but I want to talk about the difference. So we'll be right back.
Do you imagine a church brimming with engaged members, where discipleship flourishes and your mission profoundly impacts lives? Well, this can be more than an imagination. It can be reality when you read Brad Ransom's book, Creating Healthy Church Systems. This transformative resource will help you with the knowledge and skills to build the systems that are unique to your church's situation. You will be able to assess the health of your congregation and build comprehensive blueprints for the essential systems that form the foundation of a healthy church. This book offers not just theory, but it's also a very practical guide on implementing these systems. It's time for us to transform our churches. Grab this book, Creating Healthy Church Systems by Brad Ransom. To purchase or learn more, visit d6.family/store or click the link in the description below.
We're back, and we are talking to Brad Ransom, the author of the new book, Creating Healthy Church Systems. Now, Brad, we often use church growth and church health as synonymous terms, but you've pointed out they can be very different things. What is the difference between church growth and church health?
Yeah, that's a really important question that I think people do need to understand. Because a lot of times we do look at them as synonymous, and really they're completely different because there's a lot of really small churches that are healthy churches. And I believe there are a lot of larger churches that are not necessarily healthy churches, and they're hard sometimes to distinguish the difference. But just because a church is large doesn't mean it's healthy. Yeah. And so I think that it's important to realize that, again, I keep going back to the idea of community and all that. But if a church is in a community of 300 people, they're probably not going to be a mega church that runs 2,000 people. Now there are those really strange anomalies that weird things happen, but a lot of times churches are going to reflect a lot of different things, and so any church can have church growth or apply church growth. And I'm not against church growth. I'm not against the principles of church growth at all. I think we can learn a lot from it. And I think there's great principles out there that can help any church. But it's not just about doing big events. It's not just about doing something more flashy than you did last year or more flashy than the church down the street. That's oftentimes what church growth is. We'll see these things that happen. But a good example is if we do a great outreach event, but we don't have the healthy systems in place that allows us to follow up with people, assimilate those people, get them involved in discipleship, getting them through some kind of a process, then we may put on a great event, which is going to show maybe on the needle that there was a little growth spurt or whatever, which again is not necessarily bad in itself. But health is really making sure that all of those underlying things are in place that allows us to use those spikes and allow those growth principles to not just be a number or to be a successful event, but to really help us accomplish the mission, which God has called us to, which is to make disciples.
Yeah, and in the book, when you're talking about church health, you really help leaders get their hands dirty and get in the trenches and actually figure out what's going on. And there's a chapter about honest evaluations and assessments that I really found fascinating because it is so practical. You lay out how this can be done. Can you explain why that's needed and maybe even walk us through what an assessment of maybe a children's ministry or nursery ministry or something like that might look like?
Yeah. I've oftentimes jokingly told people that you can use the term wrecking ball for assessment kind of interchangeably. And I say that tongue in cheek. I'm not really serious, but it can seem like that in a lot of ways because assessment is just honestly looking at every single thing. And it's not just things that you do, but it's things that you're about, things that are facility associated with facilities, but also associated with staff and associated with all kinds of things. And so the assessment process is really just walking in with no agenda and really being honest with yourself, but also being honest with others and saying, okay, we've got to figure out exactly where we're starting from. And I think this may sound harsh, but I think a lot of times we fool ourselves or we've lied to ourselves and say, oh, everything's okay. Kind of like I did, going back to the cancer story. I thought, okay, everything's fine. I don't feel good when I eat, yada, 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 whatever. But you kind of ignore the signs. And that's what happens. And when you do assessment, you are forced to really look at everything you're doing. And so it starts with simple things like facilities. Facilities really are easy to assess because you go and you look at the carpet, you look at the paint on the walls, and you look at the various external things. It gets a little more difficult when you start really looking at ministry and staff and things like that. But everything needs to be evaluated to really be able to honestly tell where you are.
Well, I'm going to tell you about my garbage disposal for a second. Sounds like a weird transition, but I'm going somewhere, I promise. I've got a garbage disposal at home that is leaking. I have to have a bowl underneath it to catch the water that's coming out. I need to replace it, but I'm too cheap and maybe a little bit too lazy to actually replace it. So I'm basically just using duct tape to see how long I can get it going. You mentioned in your book that's not a good approach to ministry. We probably shouldn't just be duct taping things together and waiting until they break. You say that we actually need to be proactive. We need to be looking for ways to make improvements before things are actually broken. Yeah. What's the starting point for church leaders who are ready to begin implementing healthy church systems rather than just reacting to when things break?
Yeah, that's so important because that's the truth that a lot of times we get to the point, and this is where my work the last 16 years really has been kind of involved with church revitalization, is churches wait too late. And they call a consultant or denominational leader or whatever, they call somebody in to try to help them figure things out when they're down to 6 or 8 people. There's no money left. The buildings are in disrepair, and so instead of waiting to that point, I think it's important that regardless of where your church is, to say, okay, let's evaluate and see where we are. Maybe we're in a great place. And if you are, that's fantastic. And you can only build better from there. But most churches do have some room for growth. They have some area where they can improve. And so if they'll start wherever they are right now and start evaluating where they are, looking at things that are important, and then figuring out how they can improve areas that maybe are weak, create systems that maybe are missing, but then even just, accentuate the things that they're doing well. Those are all great starting places for churches.
Well, I appreciate you sharing this stuff. I do have to ask, because writing a book is not an easy process, which is more difficult, writing a book or doing burpees?
Oh, that's an unfair question because you know me too well on that. So I hate burpees more than anything in the world, but probably writing the book was harder.
And I'm kind of glad to hear that. I don't feel so guilty. But the book it's well researched. It's well thought out. It works for the small church pastor. It works for the mega church pastor.
Right.
It's something that I think every church needs to pick up and figure out, are we doing what we need to be doing? Are we on mission? Are there things that we need to do improve? And like my garbage disposal, do we need to actually fix things before they're broken rather than wait till they are? Thank you for being here today. Once again, the book is called Creating Healthy Church Systems. You can find it right now. It's available. I encourage you to pick it up. Pick it up for leaders in your church. It will definitely help you revolutionize what you're doing in your church. Brad, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Wow, he says that churches are shutting down and they do not even realize it. Let me reverse this for a moment. How many times as parents have we not noticed how much taller our kids are getting until they go spend a week at grandparents and they come back, oh my word, they look so big. The inverse is also true. We can be slowly dying and not even notice it.
Yeah.
I want our people to pay attention to that. What's your thoughts around what Brad's saying here, Marianne?
Yeah, I was really appreciative of his vulnerability about his own cancer diagnosis and how he had all these symptoms that made sense once he got the diagnosis, but he didn't see any of those things pointing to cancer. And I think that's happening in our churches. And I really love his call to evaluate. I will say I have read his book, and I think every single church and staff needs this as a tool to read collectively as a staff to evaluate if you're healthy. He calls us to evaluate. We have to look at the symptoms if we're going to treat them. We have to. We can't just have these symptoms and not go to the doctor and get treatment. And so if we're going to pray and if we're going to ask God to bring revival to our churches, we've got to evaluate what's going on the inside.
So you would not go into a courtroom and be your own attorney. We know that old adage, that's the person who has a fool for a lawyer.
Right.
You would not go into an operating room and say, hand me the scalpel. So why not grab a great book like Marianne's talking about here that Brad has written, or any other book, and go, let's reflect and see and evaluate how we're doing so that we can serve other people really well.
Absolutely. And you know what? Our episode next week comes behind Brad so beautifully. And we're going to hear next week from Tiger McLuhan, and he's going to talk about faith factors. And that just partners so well with creating healthy church systems. As you're evaluating, we're now going to look at faith factors of what is going to keep people, individuals, young people connected to the church. Thank you so much for listening. To learn more, visit d6family.com, and we can't wait to see you next week.